you counting as a sort of cumulative thing by every piece of food that you eat?
Well, in a meal, in a particular meal.
100 yards?
100 yards. Well, you know, I hesitate to. I could not have made a guess, and I might have said 100 yards. On average, you eat about 150,000 kilometres of DNA in a meal. Now, 150,000 kilometres is quite some length, and you're worried about one gene in the middle of all that. So if we were going to be affected by the genes that we eat, we would be a very curious mixture of things by now. Because, you know, I eat banana most day, I would surely have many more banana-like characteristics than I have already, if that's what was happening.
Is there any possibility that allergies, for instance,
Yes.
the growth in allergies could be caused by changes in
there is
diet?
indeed a possibility, and the regulators are alert to that, and every product, before it is approved for sale, has to go through a battery of allergy tests. And interestingly enough, nobody's come up with an allergy yet. Although you'll notice that peanuts, which are highly allergenic, are on sale to the public, with no warning on the packets.
Isn't that a possibility that you could use GM technology to reduce the allergens in peanuts? Because
Well,
it is a large crop.
I have heard that people are working on it, and indeed it is a possibility, or it is a conceivability. Whether it's possible, I don't know. It's conceivable that you could you could remove the gene which codes for the allergenic protein. I don't know how many allergenic proteins there are in peanuts, but you could conceivably remove them. And assuming that the peanut would still be a peanut, because it might be an essential protein, you would then have a non-allergenic peanut. And you could also do the same thing for strawberries and for milk and for fish and for other nuts and all the other things that people are allergic to. But, you know, it's quite a job. And I don't know, but it's a possibility, a conceivability, I should say. Yes.
Going on to the environmental side, which I guess is also one of the biggest concerns. It took years for the damage done by DDT in the food chain to be recognised. And I believe there was a detailed study carried out in the UK between 1999 and 2003, which did show that in some crops there was an effect on the insect population and the weeds, which was perhaps not what we would want to happen. Has there been any other trials of this detail in other countries?
There have been lots of trials, but nothing as extensive as the farm scale evaluation trials that held in this country 10 years ago. Lots of comments on this one. You mentioned DDT, incidentally, and there was indeed a scare about DDT and its accumulation in fish livers and possibly in the human diet.
Shell of bird shell.
Did you know about the estimates of the number of people who died because of withdrawing DDT?
Because of malaria. No, I know it's very high.
Millions of people died because of got malaria who wouldn't otherwise have got it. So you have to put that in the balance as well. But I don't want to get involved in the DDT story because that's really not that's only by the way as far as it's concerned.
I brought it in because of its concept
Sure.
in the food chain.
It's much more difficult to come to grips with environmental factors than it is with health factors, because I think everybody knows what we mean by health, but environment is a matter of opinion. For example, one of the most damaging, people relate impact with damage. If you impact the environment, people say you've damaged it. Now, if I use that sort of argument, then one of the most damaging impacts on the environment of human activity is agriculture, because vast amounts of the land surface of the earth, maybe some of the sea as well, are removed from their original wild state into an artificial state of fields, which damages it. Clearly it's damaged it. So the best thing to do is get rid of it. Get rid of all agriculture, and then we'd be in a much better state. And some people will actually take that view. So when you're talking about environment and environmental damage, I think it's very much a matter of personal taste as to what you regard as damage and what you don't. So farmers in going about their business have clearly changed the ground on which they operate from its original state. And in fact, as you know, in this great country of ours, none of it is original. The whole country is has a man-made environment. The primal forest has gone except for a few patches here and there. So all of it is man-made. I think somebody estimated 75% of the United Kingdom is agricultural in one form or another, man-made agriculture. So what is it exactly that one is concerned about environmentally? I think what seems to be the case is that everybody has their own idea of what's important environmentally. So, for example, is it important that on the actual ground on which the crops are grown, that there is a high degree of biodiversity? Is that important or is it not important? In the spaces around in the margins around the field and in the hedgerows and all the rest of it, perhaps that's where you can have the biodiversity, and let's have the bit in the centre where the crops are grown, let's have that reserved entirely for growing crops. I remember at the time of the farm scale evaluations, a Swiss friend of mine said, what is it that British farmers do? Do they grow crops or they grow butterflies? And I think it's a real question about what is it actually that you want from the countryside. And people talk about birds and bees and all the rest of it. And the way we have it at the moment is we recognise that some of the activity on the actual growing part of the land is not productive for growth, but it is to do with the other creepy crawlies and plants and whatever that happen to be growing there. And we have to make some sort of compromise position as to what to do. If we want to grow crops to feed ourselves, then we have to do it with some fair degree of efficiency, which means essentially that the area where crops grow has to be given over to the growing of crops. Otherwise we're not going to get along.
But if you handle the production systems in the right way, you can actually maintain the insect population and the weed population. For instance, I think the leaf system, incorporating in farming in the environment, they specifically aim to maintain wild populations of weeds and plants.
You can maintain some effect, but you can't maintain the original effect. You can't maintain a wild effect. You can't have a wild effect on a field. A field is not a wild place in the sense that we normally understood it. So it depends what it is that you want. And you can maintain a degree of biodiversity in a crop field, but it will not be the same as it is outside a crop field. And you have to decide, therefore, what's important and what's not important.
Is there any possibility that using GM technology is actually better?
Well, I think GM technology is such a broad term that you'd have to get down to specifics. In some cases it would be beneficial, in other cases it might not be, but that's true for anything.
The farm scale trial did show that.
The farm scale trial was not a trial of GM, it was a trial of pesticides. It was a trial of weed killers. It actually didn't test. The farm scale trial operated on the basis of growing side by side GM, non-GM, where the GM crops were grown according to the manufacturer's instructions and therefore the same in all the patches. The non-GM was grown according to the farmer's normal practice and therefore varied all over the place. And in fact it was not a trial of the crops didn't enter into it. It was the weed killers that we used, which was
But the measurements were made of the weeds and the insect populations.
Which were affected by the weed killers, not by the crops.
Yes.
So it was a trial of the weed killers.
Yes.
Well, very interesting it was too. But
it did show that it did in some cases reduce the level of insects and
in other cases enhance them.
Yeah.
So, but if you use different weed killers, that's maybe what will happen. So it was actually not a test of GM at all. It was a test of something, and the ecologists found it very interesting. But it was hardly a test of GM. There is another problem. You see, we use the word GM. GM is actually a laboratory technology. The results of GM activity, of GM technology, can be very varied indeed. I mean, the whole of the plant world is potentially susceptible, and the animal world is susceptible to it. So what is it exactly that one's talking about? And you have to do it on a case-by-case basis. You can't generalise and say that GM has this effect. Overall, it doesn't, because there are so many potential different varieties and cases of it.
What about the problem of resistant weeds, so-called superweeds? How are we going to get around that?
Well, all weeds show resistant to weed killers. I have another one of these things I picked up recently, was a graph showing the rate at which different weed killers produce resistant weeds, and they all do it. It's just a question of whether you, of how long you're going to wait. Now, one of the, of course I can't find it, one of the problems that we have, one of the problems we have under the present regime is that because it is so difficult and time consuming and expensive to get new GM strains approved, particularly in Europe, but also in other countries. People talk of at least $100 million to develop a new strain, maybe more. People tend to keep using the ones they have. They make new developments, but there is a disincentive to go out for new ideas. Now, we're too reliant, it could be said, on a small number of systems. And we should have a wider variety so that we can ring the changes more easily. And in that case, you're much less likely to get resistances. The difficulty is it's very expensive to do that. And it's made the more difficult, more expensive because of the regulatory hurdles which are put before people. Now, you see, in Europe, we can't do it at all because the regulatory hurdles are so large that the commercial companies, who are the people who would do this, won't play anymore. They say it's just not a business model for them to do anything much in Europe because the prospects are so poor. That means that we lose our plant breeding activity altogether. Many of our people have left already because they don't want to work under these circumstances. And so Europe is headed downhill fast in this area. So for all these brave talks that we get from European leaders about centres of technology, in fact we're not. We're losing our technology in various areas quite fast because of the European attitude to technology.
Does this mean then that if we're going to be stuck with the original sort of crops and things, that we will actually have to just go on using more of the same pesticide rather than try and use a wider...
It is a danger. It is not quite as bad as that because there are new developments, but there would be more new developments and there would be a better outcome if the whole attitude, if the whole system were freed up so that people could innovate more readily. And then you would have a greater number of changes that you could ring. And the whole point about using any of these killing agents, whether it's in agriculture or antibiotics for medicine, is to have lots of them so that you don't go on using the same one over and over and over again, which is absolutely bound to produce resistances.
But there aren't the same restrictions on antibiotics, and yet we still have problems there. But is that not correct?
Well, that's because it's become so difficult to find new antibiotics. I don't know how difficult it would be to find new plant systems because people, well, I won't say people haven't tried, they probably are trying, and I just don't know enough about what work is going on. But I think that it certainly could be developed a lot more rapidly and a lot more extensively than it is, but it's held back because of the regulatory problems.
Apart from resistant weeds, what about the dangers of GM plants sort of getting into the general environment and causing problems there, sort of crossing with other plants, and you get some sort of triffid emerging?
Well, you have to remember that GM plants, well, first of all, again, I must resist a general category. You have to talk about which GM plants. So let's talk about the ones we know about weed resistance. And weed resistance is not restricted to GM plants. You get spontaneous resistances to weed killers. And so, why don't they form superweeds? The fact is that crop plants are actually not very good at growing unless they're cosseted by very careful tending by farmers. And the resistance to weed killers is only of significance, of course, if the weed killer is in use. So if you get a resistant plant somewhere where the weed killer is not present, that plant has no advantage and will not necessarily survive any better than the other plant. So again, the thing to do is to ring the changes on the weed killers and not keep using the same one. And unfortunately, because we don't have enough variety of weed killers and GM at the moment, we do tend to overuse.
So that's what you're saying, is that the present opposition is in fact forcing back progress.
It is self-defeating in that sense.
Yeah. What about the sort of, because we've had to concentrate on a small number of crops growing on a huge scale, doesn't that mean a danger in narrowing the genetic base that we're working on now? whereas before we've had a huge variety of plants to
Yes.
work with.
Well, yeah, yes and no. We have reached a stage of scientific capability now where we don't actually need to have a plant in order to have its genome. The genome can be on a computer, and we can resynthesize the plant if we wanted to. If we
You can reconstitute it.
not actually yet, but clearly we're going to be able to do so before very long if we want to. So I think the idea that we actually need to keep in living form large numbers of structures as we used to have to do is perhaps less urgent now than it was, because we can retain the information in an informational sense and reconstruct if we need to do so. After all, you remember in Jurassic Park they were going to reconstruct, or maybe they did reconstruct. Well, they couldn't actually do it, but you saw which way the wind was blowing, and you can see that if they can't do it this week, they'll be able to do it next week or the week after. And people are beginning to construct bacteria from scratch, and that's how it starts. So there will come a time when you will be able to reconstruct plants or animals which no longer exist from the information you have about them. So you don't need to keep them so much literally. I mean, you might want to keep them literally as well, but if you have their information by gene sequence, that might be enough, right?
So we wouldn't need seed banks anymore.
Well, I'm not saying we wouldn't need to, but we wouldn't be so dependent on them.
But isn't some of the advantage with crops when you have a sort of serendipity, if you like,
Yeah.
with things just happen to grow side by side, and you see there's an advantage or a disadvantage? That wouldn't happen. But with the loss of biodiversity.
Well, I'm not so sure, you see, that there is any greater loss of biodiversity in the use of GM systems than there is in any modern system, where you're careful to have as clean a crop as you can and to get rid of the weeds as much as you can and so on. And that's not really very different. All the GM does maybe gives you greater facilities to do that. It means therefore you don't necessarily do it any more effectively, but you do it at less cost to yourself in terms of labour and inputs. So I'm not entirely clear that the GM thing would necessarily have a deleterious effect on biodiversity, even in, or genetic
variety.
Yes, even in the sense that you're talking about. I'm not at all sure that it would.
But we have no evidence of that yet.
No, and it depends very much on how these things are handled. And as I said much earlier on, one of the things we're very good at is learning how to handle technology as time goes on, and we're very good at learning from our mistakes in this sort of thing. And although we sometimes make serious mistakes, we seem to recover from them. And often we don't. Of course, only sometimes do we make serious mistakes, and very often we develop technologies with only minor mistakes. And so far this one's done very well.
You're saying that the scale on which it's grown, the crops are grown, and the fact that so far nothing has emerged that is detrimental.
Nothing serious has emerged. I mean, there have been small things have emerged. Yes, things have.
Such as?
Well, these resistances have shown up, but they're not overwhelming at the moment. There have been some minor problems. In some places, poor farmers have had to spend more money than they might have been willing to spend on seeds, and because of weather conditions, the crop has failed. And GM crops fail, just as any other crop will fail if the weather is particularly bad. That becomes therefore more embarrassing for a farmer who's spent more of his capital than he would otherwise have spent. But that's a business risk that everybody takes. Inevitably, when you do a business venture, you take a calculated risk about how much you're going to invest in the prospect of a return. And so, you don't always get it right.